The Bible, God's good book, God's first book of Genesis, in his book of books, cuts through the inflation of human nonsense every time. From the very beginning to Jesus' own lips, God attaches his name to some nobodies named Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so Abraham and Abraham's wife Sarah are God's story for us all. But their story will go the whole way straight into the life and death of Jesus Christ 2,000 years later. 2,000 years ago for us. And all of the ingredients of Christmas and Easter are begun with Sarah's son. So let's just say 2 Yules for Sister Sarah is what Genesis chapter 21 and 22 is going to show us. Come on in, let's check it out together and have some fun. God or not to God? That's what we do here at the Biblical Channel. We look at the question, to God or not to God? At the Biblical Channel, we always say, to God. And so, since we say to God, we have to remind ourselves that the Bible actually presents itself as God's book. And not only does it present itself as God's book, but it presents itself as a story for all of mankind that is meant to help us wring the chamois of our life to the fullest, to give us purpose, to give us meaning, to give us a connection that goes way, way back, and a connection that is very sensible in the world in which we live in. So Christianity's 2 great needs, or the Bible's 2 great needs identified with all people. And I know this because I know people and you know people, but Christianity's 2 great needs for people are the very presence of God and the forgiveness of God. And because of that, Christianity's 2 great annual celebrations are all about the presence of God, aka Christmas, and all about the forgiveness of God, aka Easter. And those fun suckers, well, they think they're very clever by telling Christians that they're just pagan festivals, Christmas and Easter. And they try to mock Christianity for that. But it's the church of Jesus Christ that has always known its purpose. And its purpose is to actually get into the pagan world, to actually get into the world of the non-elect, and to bring the great news, the big message of God's presence and God's forgiveness. And so the whole purpose of the elect is that actually to reach the non-elect. And we're going to be talking about that here in our passage today in Genesis chapter 21 and 22. But keep that in your mind. And when it comes to a Yule, and why I would say a Yule, 2 Yules for Sister Sarah. A Yule is an old pagan Germanic word for a celebration. And God's 2 big Yules, 2 big celebrations for pagans like me. Most of us come from a pagan background. Unless you're Jewish, you come from a pagan background. So to get used to the story, we're not talking about, that weird stuff that happens out in the woods with bloods and demons and cults and whatnot. We're just talking about everything that's off center, man. But either way, God's 2 big Yules begin here with Sister Sarah and her son. So Genesis chapter 21 and 22 are about setting the stage for these 2 big celebrations, these 2 big Yules, and they come from our sister Sarah. That's right, our sister Sarah. We ought to know that Sarah is our sister. She is definitely one of God's gals, and I'm one of God's guys, and we hope you're God's guys and gals out there, so she is our sister. And so forgive me for borrowing Clint Eastwood's movie title, 2 Mules for Sister Sarah, in our look at Genesis chapter 21 and 22, 2 Yules for Sister Sarah. Well, before we go any further, let us just pray like Jesus teaches us how to pray. Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as well others have debts against us. Forgive us our sins as people have sins against us, and let us be forgivers. Help us to be forgivers. So forgive us on the same basis, Lord, that we forgive others. That'll make us forgivers, Lord. Well, anyhow, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We come here to see Jesus and him only. Amen. All right, well, we have Genesis chapter 21 and 22. That's what we're going to focus on. And we're not going to read the whole thing because it's a long reading. We're going to cut out a couple sections, but let me just read the beginning of 21 and then jump into 22 and read most of that. The Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And then the next section, we have God blessing Hagar and Ishmael after getting the boot. We'll talk about it, but we're not going to read it. And then after that, Abimelech also gets a blessing. And then the sacrifice of Isaac scene, which is Genesis 22. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and he arose and went to the place of which God told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come back again to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they both went together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father! And Abraham said, here I am, son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket with his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and the sand is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose, and they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. Well, there we go. Well, remember this. remember that Genesis itself is really an answer to Moses' question. It's God's answer to Moses' question in Exodus 3, which is the next book after Genesis, by the way. But remember, Moses has a question when God appears in that burning bush. And the question Moses has is, who shall I tell them, the Israelites, is sending me? Now, Israel is the real first audience here. And Israel is the first ones who are learning and listening, probably for the first time, about their heroic forefathers. Not exactly, though, the stuff of supermen like they might have expected. The only thing that is coming through loud and clear is the story of a super god, not supermen, but a super god who seems to be extraordinarily interested in caring for the most ordinary of people. And God does not expect any of us to be extraordinary or superheroes or anything like that. And that is the sheer brilliance behind all of this, is the God who is extraordinary, is interested in the ordinary. Big lesson that we all should be learning and picking up on by now as we celebrate this story of ordinary people, because we're all ordinary people. I'm reminded of my grandma Lucy's fond phrase where she said, "I am given the luxury of weakness so that God can be glorified in his strength." That's a heck of a thing to think about. I have the luxury of weakness so that God can be glorified in his strength. And that is a huge backdrop to the whole of the Bible, to let us rest and in the luxury of being weak as we celebrate and are joyful about God in his strength. Well, anyhow, let's move forward, though. Let's move forward. And we have the birth of Isaac, which has been, long awaited. If you've been reading since Genesis 12, it has been a story of twists and turns. And now is that grand moment. 25 years have passed. Everybody gets pregnant except, the one who's supposed to be preggo, the one who is promised to be preggo, and now is that time. So if it was funny when Sara was 65 and funny when she was 75 that God was making this promise to her, then it's absolutely hilarious at the age of 90 that she actually has this babe. And she has the babe. So this is a huge fireworks section, despite the fact that it's just few in its verses. It makes the point that it needs to make. The promise that God had made is fulfilled. And also we need to gather up the idea that God had said that women were going to end up being the catalyst and the heart and the soul of God's salvation story and his plan. And it is Sara who is at center stage. This 2 Yules for Sister Sara. Sara is at the center stage of this whole thing. And this idea of remembering Genesis chapter 3, how God had promised that it will be, that the real hero of his story will be born of a woman and crush the serpent with his heel, reminds me of that glory, glory, hallelujah song. Glory, glory, hallelujah. I have read a fiery gospel writ in burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my condemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of a woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. That lyric right there just I think grabs the moment, because God is marching on. God's truth is marching on. God is putting together a storyline, and he has his own ways identifying the coolness of his story. And so the focus here is clearly a miraculous birth. This story that God is beginning with Abraham and Sarah, and is going to go the whole way to Jesus, is going to start with a miraculous birth. And it's so miraculous that I don't know if you caught it or not, but Sarah's own milk has come in as well. So not only is she giving birth as a 90-year-old, but her mammary glands are now fully loaded and ready to go for baby Isaac. She doesn't have to find a surrogate to do that. Not a big surprise. God completes the sale. You know what I mean? Doesn't surprise me at all. Shouldn't surprise you. But here is what's interesting. Isaac is not going to end up being the hero. He's instrumental, but he's not going to be the hero. The hero, spoiler alert, is going to be Jesus some 2,000 years later. But for now, the story ends with Sarah seeming to have a great sense of humor. She understands, man. People are going to laugh over this, and people are going to be stunned over this, and say, "Whoa, that is something." And Sarah does seem to have this great sense of humor until what? Well, that's the section that we didn't read. Until, as the text tells us, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham. The son of Hagar is now laughing at Sarah. So it's all fun and games until the son of the servant girl, and we've covered these grounds before, but it's all fun and games until Hagar's son Ishmael laughs. And this just sends Sarah apoplectic. She can't handle it. Out, out, out. Get out of this house. And Abraham is absolutely bummed out. The text tells us that, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son, which tells us that Abraham really liked Ishmael, and this whole thing bums him out, and he doesn't want to do it, and he knows there's this big cat fight on the scene. But interestingly enough, God intervenes and tells Abraham, go ahead and do what your wife wants you to do, which was probably a bit surprising for Abraham, I suspect. But there is an important point that's going to be made here. And the point that's going to be made here is that with the birth of Isaac, God's special revelation and his plan of salvation is on the move, and it's moving forward. And so God's going to actually use this little rift between Sarah and Hagar to keep everybody's eyes on the spiritual ball, which is his plan. And the spiritual ball at this point is very real, and that is Isaac. And so this is going to allow us to just concentrate on Isaac. We're going to move, God's going to allow Ishmael and Hagar to move off the scene, and the focus is going to be on Isaac. Now, that does not mean that God is mean. So bad reading would say, oh, God's a big meanie for, allowing Hagar to be kicked out. Well, the story is at pains to show you that God is not a big meanie, not at all. What God is doing is he is making a story out of human history. And the story that God is putting together is not only out of human history in the present, it's also about humanity's future going forward. And this is really what puts the Bible in its own class when it comes to religious documents. There's nothing like the Bible. We ought to have extreme confidence in the Bible because there is genuinely no comparison. So first of all, and what makes it truly unique is, first of all, the Bible is not about superheroes. The Bible is actually about the most ordinary people that we can relate to, just ordinary people. But secondly is this fact that God makes his own story, this story of epic proportions with the present for the future, even while nobody in the story really knows the story's end. And the central characters in the story are at times blithering idiots. And so this is what just makes the biblical storyline so authentic. It's so authentic because God is making a story that nobody knows how it will work out significantly in the future. We do now, but this connects the Bible and makes it, this long, enduring story. Listen, I can't get my own kids to do what I want them to do. So it's shocking that that God could initiate a plan and a storyline with, at times blithering idiots, and it all keeps hanging together and moving forward just like God had planned for his own purposes. And so it's the religious studies department that are universities, the fun suckers, that have absolutely no appreciation for how the Bible actually works and how the Bible is actually one book that just develops an unlikely story of nobodies, and that God does something that takes on greater and greater significance as the story goes on. And all the while, in the moment, it appears like there's nothing to see here. Isaac is a nobody. Nobody knows Isaac. Nobody's really, ever going to remember the deeds of Isaac, really. He doesn't accomplish much, except he will become the name that God identifies himself with. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Very clearly stated from the very beginning of the Bible to Jesus' own lips, that God is going to self-identify with this, story of misfits, we might even say. They're not complete misfits. They're just average, ordinary people, which the world says, that's just a misfit, right? The ordinary people are the misfits. That's what the beautiful people tell us. But anyhow, the point in these two passages about Hagar and Abimelech, right after Isaac is being born, is very clear. And that is, don't feel bad for Hagar and Abimelech, the outsiders, the non-elect. Don't feel for a second that they're not being included. Don't feel for a second that they're being excluded because God is mean. That's not it at all. The text is telling you that Hagar may not be the elect like Isaac is, and Ishmael may not be the elect like Isaac is, but God's promise, God's provision, and God's presence are given to her and Ishmael as well. And the same thing goes for Abimelech. Abimelech is an outsider. He's not part of the elect, but the whole story is about blessing the Abimelechs and blessing the Hagars. The whole point that God is making here is that his elect is not about being mean, it's about being nice. God's going to put together a serious storyline that comes through what we call the elect: Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. We'll cover that later. But it has to be, understood that God's promise and his plan of salvation, his presence, and his promise to forgive are actually going to come through this story of the elect: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the whole point of having an elect is actually to reach the non-elect, the pagan world, whatever you want to call them, it doesn't matter. It's for their sake that God is doing all of these things, which now brings us to the grandiose of all chapters, and that is the sacrifice of Isaac chapter, which feels like it's God on the verge of being weird. Let's be honest. We get butthurt pretty easy in this world. And when we come across this, we feel like, oh, come on, that's too much. But it's not too much. And you're reading it poorly if you think that kind of thought. Instead, why don't you think about this? You are told straight out of the gun, the ending is going to be good. You see, the first verse says, after these things, God tested Abraham. You know, as the reader, right off the bat, that this is going to end well. It's not going to end poorly, because God has set this thing up. And by now, God would be hoping, and I'm hoping too, that you are developing a sense of trust in the storyline, that God has proven himself to be very trustworthy. And Abraham, despite his faults, is also seeing God as trustworthy. And so not only do you know the end, but God knows the end here as well. And the real tension in the scene is not Isaac's death. The real tension in the scene is Abraham's faith. That's the tension. And when it comes to Abraham himself, if you read it and look at it, it looks like Abraham is way calmer than you are. Abe knows that the ending is going to be good too. Yes, it seems horrific, I'm sure, to Abraham, but he has developed a faith and a trust in God, the everlasting God, the God of the dead and the God of the living. He has developed a faith in this God to work it out. By now, Abraham has grown up. He is now demonstrating what it looks to be a grown-up. He simply puts his faith in God. He doesn't know how this is going to end, but he does know it's going to end well. That is the way the letter to the Hebrews portrays Abraham, that he actually had a great confidence in God bringing his son back from the dead. Whatever it took, Abraham was trusting God. And so it is very important to develop this thought in your brain. God does not test Abe to lead him into sin. God never tests anybody to lead us into sin. God does test Abe, though, so that Abe can see the quality of what he is. You see, God actually knows who we are, and we're the ones who oftentimes don't have a clue as to who we are. And so the tests that come up in life are almost always, we are the beneficiary of the tests in life. Satan actually tempts us in order to destroy us, but God tests us in order to strengthen us and to give us a picture as to who we are. I can testify to this, and I can, assure you that I look back on testing times in my life and I see how I have grown in my faith. I can see that at times I didn't have much faith, if any at all. But in this day and age, I have faith and trust in God. Now, Abraham is far from perfect. And God tests Abraham to strengthen Abraham, not to make him weak or not to destroy him, nothing like that. Abraham does trust God, even with the death of his child. And I already cited my grandma Lucy, and I will tell you that I watched my grandma Lucy deal with probably the hardest problem of life, and that is her 19-year-old son died in an automobile accident. I watched her as she dealt with that, and she cried and she cried and she cried. She was extremely sad. But I also watched how she turned that sadness into, a statement of trust and faith in God. My grandmother trusted God with the death of her son, and Abe trusts in God with the death of his son. So anyhow, let's move on to a couple notes along the way. It is worth our noting in this storyline the slow-moving nature of Abraham. Like, it takes him 3 days' journey to get this thing done. He's slowly, cutting the wood. He's making plans. He's doing all of these things, and it seems like Abraham is in slow motion, which you can't blame the guy for, putting this whole slow motion thing in action. It's also worth noting that it seems like Isaac could have overpowered the old man, but he doesn't. He doesn't put up a fight. There is absolutely nothing in this text that is indicating that Isaac is in disagreement, which we got to be careful on how much we say, but I think it's worth noting that it does seem like Isaac, at this point in time, I'd say he's got to be at least 13 years old. Time has gone by. But it seems like Isaac is a chip off the old block of Abe's faith. So Isaac may not be a hero to the rest of the world, but I think Isaac is a hero. Even in this situation, he cries out, "My father," as he recognizes that there is no burnt offering. And his father, Abraham, says that God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And at that point in time, Isaac seems to be very complicit. It seems like the setup for a future psalm in the Bible, a psalm that Jesus himself quotes. That famous psalm where Jesus says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? My Father, why have you forsaken me?" But at the same time, Psalm 22 expresses great trust in God. We may feel like, the moment is telling us that God is forsaking us, but the bigger picture here is one of faith and trust. When Jesus cites Psalm 22 on the cross, he is not perplexed. He is actually confident in God and expressing his confidence in God as well. Well, I think that's worth noting. And then the very ending of this episode is an ending of absolute jubilee, excitement, praise, celebration, big party, language is breaking out. The jubilee of Abe's faith breaks out in the heavens. The angel, God himself, expressed great jubilee that this plan of salvation for the non-elect is in full swing. Abraham's faith, Abraham's obedience is a clear picture to the world that God's plan of salvation is moving forward full steam ahead. Through your offspring, Abraham, all nations shall be blessed. And remember, that's how Abe's journey with God began. It was a promise that what God was going to do with Abraham was going to end up blessing all of the nation. The only promise that Abraham really saw was the birth of his son, and that was all that Abraham needed to see. Once Abraham saw that his own son was born in his old age in a miraculous way to his old lady Sara, well, this text ends with this huge celebration that the plan of God to bring a blessing to all nations, the non-elect, the pagan world, everybody, is in full swing. Well, that's good stuff. Now, it's also worth our time to consider how this is a story that is going to, have gravity throughout the pages of the Bible. This is the first book of the Bible. This is the 22nd chapter of the first book of the Bible. And when we get to the ending of the Bible, the Gospels and the letters, the whole storyline of Jesus Christ, we're going to see that this episode has all of the ingredients that keep moving forward. So when it comes to, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac's story here of what appears to be the willingness, to sacrifice or to trust God with the death of a son, we're going to see some important ingredients emerge. We see a lamb, or in this case, a ram. We see a firstborn. We see obedience. We see a son and a miracle birth. We see someone who is loved. Whom is loved is a quoted phrase. We see a substitution. It's not Isaac after all. It's going to be a lamb. We also see that the Lord provides is a major theme in this. Abraham says it twice. Don't worry, the Lord will provide. Abraham names the mountain in that place. The Lord will provide. The Lord will provide becomes a massive theme in the Bible. Abraham carries the wood, and a son is not withheld, and the son is spared the death in this scene. And it's a 3-day journey to Mount Moriah. Now, when it comes to Israel, remember, they heard this story, and they would soon hear the components of their own story, the Passover story, their remaining day in Egypt, when the 10th plague hit Egypt, and they were to gather up everything necessary for the Passover meal, because the Passover meal is not just a meal, it's a real event that also involves a lamb and the firstborn. And we don't have time to cover it all, but the Passover that Israel, the people, are going to celebrate for the very first time is a monumental moment that will define them as a people, and still defines the Jews today as a people. And the ingredients are still the same. We still see a lamb as the centerpiece of that meal, and that lamb is indeed a substitute, for the firstborn who are saved in Israel. And it involves the firstborn of Egypt and the firstborn of Israel. And it's the firstborn who practice or celebrate the Passover and go through obediently the moves and the actions associated with the Passover meal. Those are the ones who are spared. And Israel itself is called the Son of God, whom is loved. And there will be a substitution, and the Lord provides the necessities for the spirit of, or the angel of the Lord, to pass over and spare the son. They gather wood for the Passover. The sons are not withheld, and indeed they are spared death. And once again, the third day comes into play, because on the third day Israel is gathered before Mount Sinai, the very presence of God, and they are invited into the very presence of God. And then, some 1,500 years later, Jesus will take all of these ingredients from the Genesis story, from the Passover story, and he will use them on himself. Jesus himself will be the Lamb. Jesus himself is the first and only Son of God. Jesus himself displays complete obedience in his death on the cross. Indeed, his birth is a miraculous son story. I think I forgot that. Israel themselves is a miraculous birth story because God makes them his adopted son, his son. And the voice from heaven identifies Jesus as the Son whom is loved. And Jesus himself, in his death and in his resurrection, becomes a substitution himself. We don't need lambs or goats or anything like that anymore because Jesus is the substitution that actually guarantees our forgiveness. He takes the penalty instead of us. The Lord provides is the theme behind Jesus' motivations. And Jesus doesn't carry the wood, he carries the cross. And once again, the Son in this episode with Jesus is actually not withheld and not spared death. And so Jesus takes on the whole mechanical bits of this story to complete the final stage of God revealing his presence and his plan of forgiveness. And on the third day, it takes 3 days for Abraham to get to the mountain. It's the third day that Israel gathers before Mount Sinai. It's the third day that Jesus is risen from the dead. And so herein lies all the necessary ingredients for a 2,000-year-old story. So we will give credit for the two massive celebrations, the two Yules in Christian celebration. We'll give credit to God and Sister Sara. Because in those two great celebrations of the story is the story of God with us. And it's the story of God forgives us. And this is not for the elect. This is for the nations, all of the elect and non-elect alike. The death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Lamb, the first and only Son of God, who obeyed to his own death, and his own death was not withheld, only to be resurrected, forms the basis of the message that God has for all of us. He is present, and he is forgiving. And so the message is, come on in. This is the only God. To God, yeah, because this is the only God who can make sense out of this life that we have. Well, anyhow, that's our time in Genesis 21 and 22. We'll catch you next time.